The final frozen stillness that settled over the fields and cedar breaks along Stones River on the evening of January 3rd, 1863, was a profound, almost sacred silence, a palpable void left in the wake of receding thunder. It was not the quiet of peace, but the heavy, exhausted hush that follows a cataclysm. A silence so dense it seemed to absorb sound itself, broken only by the low moans of the thousands of wounded who still lay scattered across the contested ground like shattered dolls. The armies had disengaged, leaving behind a landscape transformed into a charnel house. Braxton Bragg's Confederate Army of Tennessee was in retreat, slogging through mud and sleet toward the rail junction at Tullahoma, a column of misery and defeat, while William S. Rosecrans's Union Army of the Cumberland remained, master of a blood-soaked field that felt more like a Pyrrhic inheritance than a prize. The immediate battle was over, but its consequences, its meanings, and its echoes were just beginning to unfold, rippling out to shape the destinies of armies, nations, and countless individual souls. The Battle of Stones River, or Murfreesboro as the Confederates called it, was far more than a mere 3-day clash in Middle Tennessee. It was a pivotal moment, a brutal hinge upon which the war in the West turned, a conflict that tested the absolute limits of human endurance and military command, and one whose outcome resonated in the corridors of power in Washington and Richmond with as much force as the roar of the 57 Union cannon that shattered John C. Breckinridge's division on January 2nd. To understand its full dimensions is to understand the intricate mechanics of a civil war, fought not just with rifles and bayonets, but with railroad timetables, political imperatives, newspaper headlines, agricultural yields, and the fragile, fractious psychology of armies whose men, on the eve of battle, could weep together over the same song. The strategic situation in the Western theatre in late 1862 was one of arrested momentum, a tense pause between storms. The Union's dizzying successes of early 1862, the capture of Forts Henry and Donelson, the bloody victory at Shiloh, the seizure of Corinth and Memphis, had given way to a frustrating operational pause, a logjam of supply and command indecision. After the confused and inconclusive Battle of Perryville in Kentucky on October 8, 1862, Bragg's army had withdrawn, unpursued with any vigor, back into Tennessee, leaving a vacuum of uncertainty. The Union commander, Don Carlos Buell, was relieved for his lack of aggressiveness and replaced by William Stark Rosecrans, a man of combustible energy, deep religious faith, and considerable ego, an Ohioan with a flair for both meticulous organization and volcanic temper. Old Rosie, as his men would come to call him with a mixture of affection and exasperation, was a planner and organizer of the First Order. He spent critical weeks in Nashville, diligently stockpiling mountains of supplies, drilling his army to a fine edge, and restructuring his command with a focus on logistical sustainability. To Washington, particularly to a careworn President Abraham Lincoln and an impatient General-in-Chief Henry Halleck, this meticulous preparation seemed like dangerous, even treasonous dithering. The political pressure for a forward movement was immense, a tangible weight. The midterm elections in November had been difficult for the Republicans, revealing war weariness, and the catastrophic Union defeat at Fredericksburg in the East on December 13th had plunged Northern morale into the depths of despair. Lincoln, bearing the twin burdens of a dissolving Union and his forthcoming moral crusade, needed a victory, any victory, to sustain public support for the war and to give tangible hope and military backing to the transformative Emancipation Proclamation, scheduled to take effect on January 1st, 1863. His telegrams to Rosecrans took on an increasingly urgent, even pleading tone, one famously reading, "I cannot contain the disaster in the East if you do not provide a victory in the West." The general, however, a fortress of stubborn conviction, refused to budge until, in his own words, his army was ready to win and win decisively. Finally, on the day after Christmas, December 26, 1862, the Army of the Cumberland, some 44 arrows strong, marched out of Nashville along 3 parallel routes, a vast blue serpent uncoiling into the winter landscape, its objective being Bragg's army of roughly 37 Surazare encamped around the vital railroad town of Murfreesboro, 30 miles to the southeast. For Braxton Bragg, the situation was equally tense but fraught with internal demons that gnawed at the Army's vitals. His army, though veteran and tough as old boot leather, was riven by deep-seated dissension, a toxic command climate that festered in the officer corps. His subordinate corps commanders, Leonidas Polk, a bishop-turned-general, and William J. Hardee, held him in low regard, and their hostility was an open secret, undermining orders and breeding contempt. The retreat from Kentucky had been a bitter pill for the proud army, and its morale was shaky, built more on personal loyalty to regiment and state than to the commanding general. Yet, Murfreesboro offered a strong defensive position, ground that could be made to favor the defender. Stones River, a shallow, limestone-bedded stream, meandered in a series of loops northwest of the town, creating natural obstacles and defining the battlefield's geography. Bragg arrayed his army along the west bank, his left anchored on the river near the Waynes Hill sector, his center along a deep railroad cut and through dense, almost impenetrable cedar forests, and his right extending to the south across open farmland. Intriguingly, his plan, like Rosecrans's, was inherently offensive in conception, a mirror image of aggressive intent. Both generals, studying the same ground from opposite sides, came to the same conclusion: attack the enemy's right flank, roll up his line, and cut him off from his line of retreat. For Rosecrans, the lifeline of the Nashville Pike. For Bragg, the roads leading south to Shelbyville and Manchester. It was a recipe for a collision of the highest order, a meeting engagement of immense violence where the force that struck first and hardest would gain a decisive, perhaps war-ending advantage. The days of December 29th and 30th were spent in cautious reconnaissance and sharp, sputtering skirmishes as the Union Army concentrated, the two forces feeling each other out like prize-fighters in a dark room. On the night of the 30th, the armies camped so close that their picket lines were almost within conversational distance, the glow of countless campfires illuminating the low winter clouds. That evening, the famous haunting musical duel occurred, northern and southern bands vying with patriotic airs, until, in a moment of transcendent melancholy, both sides' bands joined in a shared, heartfelt rendition of Home Sweet Home. A moment of poignant, shared humanity that would be violently obliterated with the dawn, a last whisper of a common American identity before the slaughter. Bragg's army moved first, seizing the initiative in the thick, chilling fog of dawn on December 31st. Hardee's corps, strengthened by a division from Polk, launched a massive, perfectly timed assault on the Union right flank, held by Alexander McDowell McCook's corps. The attack, delivered in echelon, brigade following brigade in a rolling sequential hammer blow, achieved devastating, near-total surprise. Many of McCook's men, particularly in the brigade of Brigadier General Edward N. Kirk, were still asleep in their bedrolls or cooking breakfast over small fires, their arms stacked. The initial Confederate wave, led by the hard-hitting divisions of John P. McCown and the brilliant Patrick R. Cleburne, swept over them like a grey tide. The Union right flank, occupying ground from which Rosecrans had foolishly refused to allow entrenching for fear of making the men offensive-minded, simply disintegrated under the onslaught. Regiment after regiment was flanked, overrun, or forced into a headlong, chaotic retreat. The violence was intimate and brutal in the dense cedar thickets, known as the slaughter pen, where visibility was limited to a few yards, and the eerie, screeching rebel yell echoed disorientingly through the gnarled trees, a sound that struck terror into the heart. Key positions like the Goring Lytle Farm became isolated pockets of horrific resistance, islands of blue in a surging grey sea. Union Brigadier General Joshua Sill, a promising young officer, was killed almost instantly. Kirk fell with a grievous wound. The collapse was so rapid and complete that by 10 a.m., McCook's corps had been driven back nearly 3 miles, in many places a complete rout, a flood of panic-stricken men, caissons and ambulances streaming toward the Nashville Pike. The entire Union battle line was bending backwards, pivoting on its shuddering center, in grave, imminent danger of being snapped in two. which would mean the destruction of the army. Rosecrans, at his headquarters at the Murphy House, heard the crescendo of battle swelling from the south with a dread certainty. He reportedly exclaimed, "The battle is there, I am going there," and spent the rest of the day in a frenzied, personal, almost mythic effort to stave off disaster. He was everywhere, a conspicuous, rallying figure on a sweating horse, gathering broken regiments, directing artillery batteries into gaping holes, shifting reserves with frantic urgency. His personal intervention was crucial, a one-man bulwark against the tide. At one point, he rode directly into the path of a panicked brigade, seizing its colours from a fleeing standard-bearer and bellowing at the men to stand and face the enemy. On another occasion, an aide was decapitated by a cannonball just feet from him, splattering the general with blood and brain matter, which he wiped away without breaking stride, a moment of horrific testament to his focus. While Rosecrans provided the desperate energy and will, it was the tenacity of specific Union units in the center that provided the physical anchor, the rock upon which the Confederate wave finally broke. As the Confederate assault drove north and east, its axis of advance aimed like a spear toward a key terrain feature. A 4-acre grove of cedar and oak atop a low limestone ridge, known locally as the Round Forest. This position, defended initially by Colonel William B. Hazen's brigade of Philip Sheridan's division, and later reinforced by other desperate units, became the linchpin of the entire Union Army, the hinge of fate. If it fell, Bragg's victorious troops would sever the Nashville Pike, the Union Army's sole line of supply and retreat, and complete its utter destruction. The battle had narrowed to this one patch of wooded, rocky ground. What followed at the Round Forest, soon christened Hell's Half Acre, or the Slaughter Pen with grim soldierly accuracy, was some of the most concentrated, savage and relentless fighting of the entire Civil War. Throughout the late morning and long afternoon, Bragg, sensing the critical prize, hurled a series of frontal assaults against this natural fortress. The Union defenders, sheltered behind limestone outcroppings and hastily felled trees, were supported by a masterful, murderous concentration of artillery directed by the gifted Captain John Mendenhall. Breckinridge's and Cleburne's men advanced time and again across open fields and into the dark wood, lines of grey and butternut stretching across the plain, only to be met by sheets of canister and volleys of musketry that shattered formations and piled heaps of bodies on the frozen ground in tangled, horrific mounds. The fighting devolved into point-blank firefights and hand-to-hand combat with bayonets, clubbed muskets, and knives, a primordial struggle in the smoky gloom. One Confederate brigade commander, Brigadier General James R. Chalmers, saw his Mississippi Brigade lose over 40% of its strength in under 30 minutes, a terrifying rate of consumption. Hazen's men, running low on ammunition, their coats torn and faces blackened by powder, held with a stubbornness that bordered on the fanatical. Their epic stand allowed Rosecrans the critical hours to reform a new, final defensive line along the Nashville Pike, a last-ditch position anchored by a dense, awe-inspiring concentration of artillery, a grand battery that promised annihilation to any new assault. By late afternoon, the Confederate offensive, though spectacularly successful on the tactical level, having captured thousands of prisoners and scores of cannon, had run out of steam and blood. It had not broken the Union center, nor taken the vital Pike. The Union Army, though badly mauled and compressed into a tight, vulnerable salient, remained coherent, defiant, and crucially, still tied to its lifeline. The night of December 31st was a scene from a medieval vision of hell, a darkness alive with suffering. A cold, drizzling rain began to fall on a landscape littered with over 16 Awauzeran casualties from the day's fighting, a harvest of anguish. The cries of the wounded, left between the lines or in areas now under enemy control, were a continuous, agonizing chorus that no survivor would ever forget, a sound that pierced the soul. In the Union headquarters, a somber council of war took place by flickering lantern light. Corps commanders Alexander McCook and Thomas Crittenden, whose wings had borne the brunt of the assault and were shattered, advised retreat, a sensible, preservationist view. The army was battered, they argued. Another day like this would destroy it utterly. Rosecrans, his face etched with exhaustion, listened to their grim counsel. He then polled his chief of staff, Julius Garrichet, unaware Garrichet had been killed earlier that day, and other officers. The consensus was mixed, fraught with fear, but the weight of opinion among his engineers and some brigade commanders leaned towards staying and fighting. After a long, heavy silence, Rosecrans made his decision, a gamble for immortality or ruin. "Gentlemen," he stated, his voice firm, "we will now retreat when we have beaten them." It was a monumental declaration, a commitment to stand and fight on the very ground where they had nearly been destroyed, a test of nerve against the coming dawn. That same night, Bragg, receiving optimistic but misleading reports from his front, believed firmly he had won a decisive victory. He sent a jubilant telegram to Richmond. "The enemy has yielded his strong position and is falling back. We occupy the whole field." He was convinced, wishfully, that Rosecrans would withdraw under cover of darkness. The contrasting perceptions in the two headquarters that night, one of desperate resolve, the other of illusory triumph, would define the fateful next 2 days and the ultimate legacy of the battle. January the 1st, 1863, dawned not with a roar of musketry, but with a heavy, sporadic skirmish fire, a day of eerie quiet and grim administrative horror. Both sides used the fragile lull to tend to the mountains of wounded, shore up their lines with fresh earthworks, and assess their mangled commands. For the shivering soldiers, it was also the first day of a new year, marked not by celebration or hope, but by exhaustion, the pervasive coppery stench of death, and the sight of endless burial details. On this day, unbeknownst to most men in the ranks, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation took legal effect, fundamentally transforming the character and purpose of the war from a fight for union to a crusade for freedom. Though news of it would only slowly filter down to the men huddled in the Tennessee mud. Rosecrans spent the day not in rest, but in actively, aggressively improving his position. He ordered his engineers and every available man to fortify the line along the Nashville Pike with breastworks and lunettes for artillery. In a move of profound symbolic importance, he also directed Colonel Hazen's men, the heroes of the Round Forest, to construct a small permanent monument on the ground they had held with such sacrifice, a simple square block of limestone, inscribed with the names of their fallen comrades. The Hazen Brigade Monument, dedicated in early 1863, stands today as the oldest intact Civil War battlefield monument, a poignant soldier-built testament to the cost of holding that ground, erected while the war still raged. Bragg, meanwhile, interpreted the lack of a Union retreat as mere stubbornness, a rearguard action. His characteristic irascibility, sharpened by the static situation and perhaps a dawning uncertainty, grew into frustration. He began to look for another point to strike, to deliver the coup de grace. He found his target on his own left flank. Union troops from Crittenden's corps, specifically the division of Brigadier General John M. Palmer, had on December 31st crossed Stones River and occupied a commanding rise known locally as the Cowan's Hill or the East Bank Heights. From this position, Union artillery could enfilade any Confederate movement along the river and threatened the very flank of Bragg's main line. Bragg decided this Yankee salient must be eliminated, crushed. He ordered John C. Breckinridge, whose division was posted on the Confederate left, to attack and drive the Federals back across the river on January 2nd. Breckinridge, a proud Kentuckian and former vice president, was aghast. He, along with his veteran brigade commanders, rode forward and could clearly see the suicidal nature of the terrain. The attack would require his men to advance nearly a mile across open, rolling fields, descend into a shallow valley, the McFadden's Ford area, and then ascend a slope dominated by the high west bank of the river, where Rosecrans had massed every available gun in a grand battery. It was, Breckinridge argued with passion, nothing less than murder. Bragg, his judgment clouded by frustration and suspecting his subordinate of timidity or insubordination, insisted. The order was peremptory, final. At about 4 p.m., as the winter sun began to sink in a cold, clear sky, casting long shadows, Breckinridge's 5 brigades, some 500 men, stepped off in a majestic, doomed line of battle, flags flying, a picture of martial glory that was also a walking target. Initially, through sheer force of momentum and courage, the attack met surprising success. Palmer's outnumbered division was pushed back from the hill, the Confederate battle flags surged forward, reaching the riverbank, and a cheer went up from the Southern lines. It was at this exact moment, with the Confederates most exposed, that the carefully prepared Union trap was sprung. Captain John Mendenhall had assembled a grand battery of 57 guns, a mix of Napoleons, Parrott rifles, and howitzers on the high ground west of the river, perfectly positioned to fire directly into the flank and rear of the advancing Confederates. At a range of less than half a mile, the order to fire was given. The effect was apocalyptic, a vision of industrial age hell. A coordinated storm of shell, spherical case, and canister swept the field like a scythe. Whole ranks were obliterated in an instant, men thrown like ragdolls. A Union observer wrote that the valley looked like a huge volcano, erupting with iron and flame. The majestic Confederate advance dissolved into a bloody, chaotic scramble for survival, a scene of utter pandemonium. As the shattered survivors recoiled in disbelief and terror, a fresh Union division under Brigadier General James S. Negley counterattacked with fixed bayonets, driving them back in complete disarray. In less than 1 hour of horror, Breckinridge's command lost over 1,700 men, a catastrophic rate of loss. The general returned to headquarters that night in a cold, trembling fury, reportedly confronting Bragg with the words, "General, your order was executed, and my men have been murdered." The Battle of Stones River was effectively over, decided in that one furious hour of cannon fire. That night, as if nature sought to compound the misery, a fierce winter storm swept in, turning the rain to sleet and snow, coating the hideous landscape in a cruel, beautiful frost, adding hypothermia to the agonies of the thousands of wounded still lying unattended on the field. Faced with this staggering repulse, a demoralized army, dwindling ammunition, and the prospect of a reinforced and now aggressively confident enemy, Bragg convened a gloomy council of war on the night of January 3rd. The vote of his corps and division commanders was unanimous: retreat. There was no other choice. The Army of Tennessee began to withdraw in the early freezing hours of January 4th, leaving its campfires burning brightly to disguise the movement, a ruse of despair. The retreat through the freezing mud to Tullahoma was a miserable, soul-crushing affair, deepening the army's gloom and cementing the commanders' mutual animosities. Rosecrans, cautious and spent, did not pursue in force until January 5th, and the Confederate army escaped intact to fight another day, though its strategic position in central Tennessee was now severely and permanently weakened. The aftermath of Stones River revealed its profound and asymmetric impact on the war's trajectory. In the North, the news, arriving by telegraph in the first week of January, was received as nothing short of salvation, a divine reprieve. Coming on the heels of the disaster at Fredericksburg and the political turmoil surrounding the Emancipation Proclamation, Rosecrans's bloody, hard-won victory was a potent tonic for the despondent Union spirit. Newspapers that had been filled with doom now heralded it as a great, decisive triumph. President Lincoln, whose anxiety during the battle had been acute, wrote Rosecrans a deeply personal and revealing letter. "You gave us a hard-earned victory, which had there been a defeat instead, the nation could scarcely have lived over." The victory secured Nashville as an unassailable Union bastion, protected Kentucky from further invasion, and crucially opened the path for future advances toward Chattanooga and the deep heart of the Confederacy. For the Army of the Cumberland, the battle forged a tough, enduring identity, a legend of resilience. They had stared into the abyss on December 31st and had not broken. The experience created an unbreakable bond of suffering and shared survival that would sustain them through the even greater trials of Chickamauga and the siege of Chattanooga later that fateful year. In the South, the reaction was one of bitter disillusionment and corrosive public blame. The retreat from another promising field, following the retreats from Perryville and Corinth, and coming before the eventual disasters at Vicksburg and Gettysburg, was a crushing blow to Confederate morale in the West, a sense of squandered opportunity and blood. The already toxic command climate in the Army of Tennessee worsened irreparably, becoming a festering wound. Bragg's subordinates, convinced of his tactical incompetence and personal failings, communicated their scathing grievances directly to President Jefferson Davis in Richmond. While Davis, out of a combination of personal loyalty, stubbornness, and a lack of clear alternatives, retained Bragg in command, the Army's operational effectiveness was crippled by command dysfunction for months, a paralysis at the top. The common soldiers, who had fought with tremendous courage and come so achingly close to a decisive victory, felt betrayed by their leadership, their sacrifice rendered meaningless by retreat. The strategic consequence was the irreversible loss of central Tennessee. The rich agricultural and iron-producing region around Murfreesboro, with its vital railroad network, was now firmly under Union control, a dagger pointed at the strategic linchpin of Chattanooga. The human cost was staggering, a number that numbs the mind. Of the approximately 81 000 men engaged, nearly 24 000 were killed, wounded, or missing, a casualty rate of about 30%, one of the highest of the war. The Union lost roughly 13 000 men, about 31% of its force, and the Confederacy about 11 000, about 30%. In percentage terms, it was one of the deadliest battles of the entire war, exceeding even the famed carnage of Antietam. The battle lacked the grand, sweeping maneuvers of Second Manassas or Chancellorsville. It was, instead, a brutal head-on collision of wills and mass, a soldier's fight where success was measured not in miles gained, but in the holding of a single woodlot or a rocky ledge for one more hour. Its tactical lessons were stark and prescient. The devastating, war-altering power of massed, concentrated artillery, foreshadowing the Gunners' War of 1864-65. The critical, life-saving importance of terrain and field fortifications. The successful defense of the Round Forest versus the catastrophic collapse of the open Union right, and the grim, bloody limits of the frontal assault against a determined, well-positioned enemy armed with modern weapons. But the significance of Stone's River transcends mere tactics and casualty lists, reaching into the political and psychological marrow of the war. It was a battle of profound political and psychological timing, a hinge of national fortune. It provided the Union with its only major winter victory in the dark, desperate period between Fredericksburg and Gettysburg, a proof that the cause could still prevail. It validated Lincoln's relentless strategy of continued pressure on all fronts, and demonstrated that the Union war machine, for all its early inefficiencies and blundering generals, could absorb terrible, almost unsustainable losses and persist, its material and human reserves deeper than the Confederacy's. For the Confederacy, it exposed the fragile foundation of its Western defense and the crippling, potentially fatal effects of poor command harmony and a strategy too reliant on the defensive offensive. The battle also highlighted the evolving, brutal nature of Civil War leadership. Rosecrans, though flawed and later relieved after Chickamauga, showed in those critical hours on December 31st the personal, visceral leadership and relentless energy that could physically hold an army together in crisis, a different, more desperate skill than grand strategy. Bragg, for all his administrative ability and aggressive intentions, demonstrated a fatal inability to manage proud subordinates, read battlefield realities accurately, or adapt his plans when initial. Dazzling success faded into stalemate, flaws that would haunt the Confederacy in the West. Today, the Stones River National Battlefield preserves a quiet, haunting portion of this hallowed and terrible ground. Visitors can walk the solemn paths through the Stones River National Cemetery, where over 6,000 Union soldiers rest in neat rows under ancient trees, or stand in contemplation before the ancient pockmarked stones of the Hazen Monument, touched by the hands of the men who fought there. They can gaze across the now peaceful open field, where Breckinridge's charge met its fiery end, or wander the still dense, silent cedars of the slaughter pen, where the air itself feels heavy with memory. The landscape seems to hold the echo of the sound, the earth-shaking roar of cannon, the relentless crackle of musketry, the chilling rebel yell, the defiant Union cheers, and beneath it all, the endless haunting cries of the wounded that filled the freezing nights. The battle's legacy is complex and dual-natured, a strategic Union victory born from near-tactical catastrophe, a Confederate offensive that began with one of the most successful flank attacks of the entire war but ended in retreat and bitter recrimination, and a bloody, indelible testament to the fact that by 1863 the war had become a grinding, total contest of attrition where the deeper resources of national will, manpower, and industrial material would ultimately determine the fate of the fracturing nation. Stones River did not end the war, but it ensured that the path forward for the Union in the West remained open, and it proved, at a moment of the deepest national despair for the North, that the Confederacy's defensive perimeter had its breaking point. That courage alone could not hold back the relentless blue tide. In the grand, tragic, and redemptive narrative of the Civil War, the battle stands as a stark, necessary, and brutally expensive turning point, a costly down payment on the future victories at Vicksburg, Chattanooga, and Atlanta that would ultimately seal the Confederacy's fate.